Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. It's my great privilege to welcome Michael Spence, Nobel Prize winner, former head of the Stanford Business School, and chairman, among many other things, and chair of the rather unique Commission on Growth and Development, sponsored by several national governments and the World Bank, with their report coming out in 2010. Michael, thank you very much for joining us today.
No, it's great to be with you and interact again, Anne. So I'm thrilled.
Great, thank you. I'm going to jump right in and please tell us what the Global Commission on Growth and Development was and why it was important and perhaps a bit unusual.
Well, so the so-called Growth Commission started work in 2006. So, roughly 15 years after the much maligned Washington Consensus. I don't know how many of your viewers have actually read the Washington Consensus, but if you do, it doesn't deserve the beating it's taken. Anyway, we thought, and the commission consisted of two economists. We had lots of economists as advisors, but Bob Solo and me. But the majority of people, like Trevor Manuel, were people who had held important policymaking positions in government, some political as well, and so their experience was the definitive part of the Growth Commission work. And our self-determined assignment was to collect the lessons from the extraordinary experience in the 15 years between 1990 and say 2005. India started growing, South Africa, became a free country and started to perform reasonably well. China was in its extraordinary growth phase and so on. And there was much more. So we thought, we'll see if we can learn enough about that experience and some very important research that had been done on the sort of academics and think tank side, and see if we could put it together. And the goal was to deliver whatever insights we could to the next generation of leaders and policymakers and even business people in the developing world. So that's kind of where we went. We knew, whenever you do one of these things, Anne, it's going to be dated, and it is, right? We knew global warming was coming, but the awareness wasn't very high. We certainly didn't see the full dimensionality of the digital transformation that's underway, and we definitely did not see the sort of fragmentation and partial falling apart of the global order that served a lot of countries so well at the time. But anyway, that's what we were doing. It's probably time for another. It's interesting, the timing is the same as the United Nations goals. So MDGs went 2000 to 2015, SDGs were halfway through, go to 2030, and maybe we'll do something else after that.
So let's start then with, what were the key insights and recommendations in your view that are worth preserving, or where did you end up?
Well, I guess at the risk of sounding overly simple and saying things that people already know, all successful sustained high growth cases, meaning countries, leverage the global economy's technology and openness and its demand. Those are the two critical things. And if you take those away, a country can't grow at high speed. It can grow, but it's like tying a hand behind the back, because the global demand allows you to specialize and you go down learning curves. If you're relying on domestic demand in the early stages of growth, every market's small. You have to learn to do a whole bunch of things instead of specializing and so on. And this inbound transfer and adaptation of technology was the other important thing. So that was one. Second, there's no kind of hard and fast theory, but as a rule of thumb, if you want to sustain high growth rates in the 6% range, we set the bar pretty high at 7%. and found, I'll tell you a funny story about that, 13 countries that had managed to do that on average for 25 years. But you got to have investment rates as a, and gross investment as a fraction of GDP in infrastructure, human capital, et cetera, of about 25% or more of GDP. So if you go around the world and look at countries that, have a growth spurt, but their investment rates are low, you just can't keep it up. And if you split it up, I mean, a good chunk of that, maybe 20% probably has to be public sector investment that is creating, public goods or things that where the private returns don't even come close to capturing the social returns. The thing that there are other things, economic and financial and fiscal stability, but nobody disagrees with that. It's just a question of getting it done, right? The thing I think that was maybe I didn't expect or to see coming is very early on, the Singapore people wrote a paper and said this is really about political economy and leadership. And it was very convincing, partly a story of Singapore, partly, more general principles. But I think it influenced the work of the commission, and I think it's influenced subsequent thinking. I mean, it's just not possible to study. I mean, there's lots of technical aspects of growth, what kind of industrial policy works, how do you manage the capital account, it goes on and on and on. But the core thing is if you have an economy in a sort of low or no growth equilibrium, something fairly dramatic happens when that shift occurs. And that seems to be where leadership plays just a crucial role, because you have to have a vision, you have to express it well, you have to change expectations. If you don't change expectations, you won't change investment behavior, and so on. So that was the eye opener for me.
That's very interesting, because a lot of economists tell you what to do, but they minimize the political economy side and very seldom talk about leadership in the way that you're mentioning.
Well, it's hard to measure. It's, and this generation of economists likes to measure things. Although, the work of, Darren Acemoglu and Peter Robinson and many others is, we're straying into the political economy terrain more than we used to in the old technical days.
Do you think the commission had a lot of impact? Did it impact countries? What is your impression of that?
So in a masterpiece of timing, we published the main report in the spring of 2008, which was promptly followed by an enormous financial crisis, the biggest one we've had since the Great Depression. So that wasn't a winner in terms of, garnering attention. But I think the thing that encourages me is that, it seems to have had a reasonably long life, at least among the people who are seriously engaged with this. And that I judge that basically in terms of feedback over the years. Sometimes something makes a big splash and then you never hear about it again. I don't mean, it's not on the New York Times bestseller list, but it's but for people who are kind of wrestling with this and fighting, the battles and winning some and losing some, it seems to have, it left a legacy. But as I say, well, we'll talk about this, but it needs updating,
Right.
For sure.
Basically, it was, you looked at countries that had achieved 7% growth over a sustained period of 20 years on average. And
25,
25. And you looked at 13 countries, if I'm right. Is that right? You found 13.
Well, we found 13. Actually, so I'll tell you this funny story because I can do it quickly. We found 12. And then Edmar Basha, our Brazilian colleague, who was part of the triumvirate that got inflation under control in the 1990s, terrific person, went back to 1950 and discovered that Brazil should be in. So we added Brazil. And then, but the capstone of this story is about 2 years ago, Edmar wrote to me and to Roberto Zaga, who was the secretary, very important secretary of the commission, the one who really made it keep going. And he said, actually, we redid the accounting and that was a mistake. Brazil doesn't belong there. So it's really 12 again, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. People said that's a biased sample. Of course it's a biased sample. We could have, sort of had several more pages documenting, disasters at the country level, but we didn't think that was particularly helpful. And we were really quite curious whether there were common features to the successful cases, but it wasn't an empirical study. I mean, we were after guidance, basically.
Right. What was unusual, one of the things that was unusual is that you spent some time, or your recommendations did, on what countries shouldn't do. Could you tell us some of those? What were those key insights?
Well, I'll tell you where it came from. So one of your previous guests and a good friend of both yours and mine, Montek Alawalia, this was his idea. So he basically said, I think he attributed this part of this to Larry Summers. But anyway, he said, if you keep saying what you're supposed to do and what the right answer is, it's boring. And so he said we should have a section, a very small section on bad ideas. And so we thought about that and we decided, but Montek said one other thing it's worth noting. He said, policy making in a development context is, operating in a highly uncertain environment. And you have two jobs. The one that people talk about all the time is to find, good policies and try to implement them. And we can talk about implementation, but, a lot of these people had experience with that. But he said the second one, there's a lot of bad ideas come up and you have to stop them before they get implemented. I think he had some colorful metaphor, like having a bottle and hitting them over the head before they got to the starting line. So anyway, the way we implemented that is everybody, produced 2 or 3 of the worst ideas they'd seen. And we just wrote 2 pages and summarized them, Probably the worst one is subsidizing energy, fossil fuels, right? I mean, if it were a tax, it would be regressive. It is a bad way for governments to spend money. And the reason they do it is it doesn't look like they're spending money, all right? They just tell the oil companies, sell this, at below market prices. What they should be doing is, either selling it at market prices or taxing it, collecting the revenue and investing in stuff that's actually important, like education and infrastructure. But in a longer term, if you subsidize fossil fuels, you're going to build a ton of infrastructure that's mismatched badly to a world, facing climate change and sustainability. And these assets last for 30 or 40 years. Wow. So it's much deeper than just screwing up the current, or short run resource allocation. It really, sets you off on the wrong path. Well, anyway, that was one candidate. There were lots of others, but it just livened things up. I after the report came out, I got a few emails saying, I can't remember exactly how many there were, 12 or 13 or something like that. Anyway, somebody would write and say, Don, I really like that, 2-page section. That was the best part of the report. And then I checked and our government's doing, I don't know, 80% of them or something like that. Anyway. Yeah. Montek's insight, I think, was right.
No, it's a helpful concept. I think sometimes governments shouldn't do anything. And sometimes they shouldn't do the wrong thing. Getting it right is very hard.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So give us a flavor. I'm going to come back, I'm sure, to some of these. Give us a flavor of some of what would you look at today that you didn't look at then? Or, what's changed since the Growth Commission that you think is really important?
So there's a lot of things that have changed. I won't be long-winded here. I'll just tick them off and then we can pursue any one you like. When we started work, we were, basically operating with a world, a developing world where the vast majority of people, unlike the vast majority of people, and even the vast majority of countries, were not in the middle income category. We hadn't have enough of the high growth. Now, there were exceptions, South Africa is a middle income country. Argentina was before they started, going backwards. And South Korea and the Taiwanese economy had made pretty successful runs, as had Singapore, and even Hong Kong. But people tend to dismiss them because they're city states, sort of, or city provinces, or whatever you want to call them. But the big change between then and now is that as a result of these successful growth episodes, you have the vast majority of people, are in the middle income category. So the challenges are, don't get caught in the middle income trap, change the pattern of investment, so you're upgrading a whole lot of things, the science and technology base of the economy, the human capital to go along with it, and so on, that are really sort of, they're not different at the kind of banner, headline level, but they're very different in sort of content. And then you have this phenomenon of people. So that's one thing. That doesn't mean I think we should forget about the low income countries or countries that haven't started the growth process until relatively recently, or not at all. So it's not setting them aside, but nevertheless, the kind of mass of experience is now kind of in the middle income category, and that's a different kettle of fish. And we focused a lot on the low income category, partly because of the timing of the Growth Commission, but also because if you look at growth, if you start at relatively low income levels, like $500 or $1,000 per person, and start doubling, when even, you're doubling every decade at 7%, and not many people do that, you got to double a lot of times before you're, firmly in the middle income category. And once you're in the middle income category, you probably got 2 more doublings and you're at the low end of the developed country income. So a lot of time is spent making that initial transition, given the way we categorize it. So we thought it was worth the effort. We didn't see the fragmentation of the global economy. We just blissfully assumed that some version of that world order, with all its flaws and warts, but nothing like what we're seeing now, would happen. We did not see the magnitude and dimensionality, I don't think anybody did, of the digital revolution. It had started, the iPhone came out just before we started work. And so this notion that you're building economies on digital foundations wasn't there. The notion, I've spent a lot of time, if I get sidetracked here, just stop me, but with people in artificial intelligence in the last 3 or 4 months, just trying to upgrade my understanding of where they are and what challenges they still need to kind of deal with. But, many, many non-resource rich countries grew, based on connecting to the global economy with comparative advantage in labor-intensive process-oriented manufacturing and assembly. And it's not sometime in the future, digital technology is going to displace that, right, in the form of robotics. Now, it's not there yet, and it turns out the challenges in robotics are bigger than I thought they were, for reasons we can talk about later if it's of interest to your audience. But nevertheless, there's a question about whether that's going to work or have, the same kind of power that it had in the first 50, 60 years after World War II. So we didn't see the fragmentation in the global economy. We didn't see, to be honest with you, instability and, crisis in the developed world that then spilled over. We didn't see the full dimensionality, the digital technology, and as I say, it's got huge potential to foster inclusive growth patterns, but it's a double-edged sword. It could cut off this, the so-called Asian growth model. So wow. That's a short summary of all the stuff we didn't see. I'm sure there's a lot more. Right.
Let's hone in on that. So my big question is inclusive growth still possible in the 21st century? That's the big question. And then I want to talk about manufacturing and low-skill manufacturing, and then get on to AI and digital, which a lot more than I do about that. So perhaps the big question is, can we get inclusive growth in a world which is digitizing, and where it looks like you're going to need more and more skills in order to participate? What does that do for so many millions of people who don't have those skills? How do you see that? Or other
Well,
thoughts?
I think it's still possible, but I think honesty requires one to sort of admit that not all of the major trends, including some aspects of the digital ones, are pushing in that direction. In fact, some of them are pushing, against. So, on a global basis, you know, inter-country income inequality declined because of developing country growth. So that was a pretty massive exercise in inclusiveness. I think there's a question mark. I mean, I am really worried about the low-income countries because growing is hard. They all have, various versions of the challenge of demographics, government, finding the way to connect to the global economy, et cetera. And then when you throw in a shock-prone world where capital's, whizzing around, creating volatility and even some instability. The pandemic was a huge shock and left a lot of these countries with very limited fiscal capacity because it got used up trying to, the vaccine rollout as an exercise in sort of global cooperation in crisis mode was not an impressive story. When you get to the low income countries, was late and got bogged down in too many players with views and not enough decision makers saying, okay, I've heard enough, now we're going to do this. What happens in a well-led country or a company is somebody listens to all the discussion and then says, okay, that now we're done. We're going to actually do something. And that didn't happen to the same extent in the vaccine rollout. And so you have the pandemic as a huge shock, and the climate shocks. I mean, they're everywhere, but they're harder to deal with. We last week, a very substantial chunk of Emilia-Romagna, which is one of the regions south of here in Italy, was underwater. Last summer, a third of Pakistan was underwater. I mean, so when you add a less supportive and even at times hostile environment, adding across, pandemics, geopolitical tensions, climate, and so on, you add those to the challenges that you already have to deal with in a, even in a benign environment like the one we used to have. It's starting to look like a perfect storm. And I think this is an area where, this dimension of inclusiveness requires a kind of global cooperation to sort of help these countries out. I don't mean take them over, you know this very well from experience in many countries, including South Africa. I've never been in a country that, even if it wasn't doing very well, that was enthusiastic about having external folks deciding anything. It just doesn't, not on, except in the most extreme kind of humanitarian crisis situations. But that said, I don't, once they get going in the right direction, with the appropriate leadership, there's a lot you can do to be supportive. I'm hoping the international financial institutions, which are struggling a little bit, are increase their capitalization and become a more powerful kind of supporting actor for a lot of these countries. But that sometimes people, Dan, ask me, do you still believe in convergence? And the answer is yes. Like meaning, catch up. Yes, but the worry is about the late starters.
And what about middle income countries?
Yeah.
I understand about late starters. What about middle income countries? You've said that the manufacturing option for the so-called East Asian model for export is still available. One shouldn't give up on it yet. Can you talk a bit about that and then middle income countries?
Well, so yes. So a middle income country basically has to give that up anyway, right? I mean, you can't get the $10,000 of per capita income and argue that you're the low labor, destination for labor intensive manufacturing and assembly. I mean, you just can't. And so this baton passing has been going on ever since World War II, Japan to South Korea and Taiwan to, Indonesia, eventually China, Vietnam, Bangladesh more recently. So that's, at least in principle, still possible. But there's internal enablers of that, and if they're not present, the outside folks, the investors, the multinationals, and so on, don't show up. There is a dimension of which has growth and inclusiveness implications that's actually quite positive, and that is this global explosion of entrepreneurial activity. Not much of it around tech of some kind. Well, a lot of it around digital, and so then that's just a dramatic change. I mean, when the Growth Commission was working, if you ask people, well, where are the major centers of sort of development, innovation, and in technology areas, you probably could count them on one hand, right? You can't do that. It's on every continent now. And they're solving local problems. So it's not just Me Too. Amazon's model doesn't work as well in India with the fragmented retail sector, but the local entrepreneurs can figure out what the problems are and what solutions are. And I don't want to be long-winded, but a lot of these business models leverage the capacity of digital in, say, e-commerce and fintech and credit and whatnot to get to people who are remote and relatively underserved by the traditional channels in an economy. And so a lot of the business models are good business models from the point of view of rate of return, precisely because they bring more people into the economy or bring them in faster or something like that. I was saying to the people, I mean, the India case study, I think, is really interesting. I don't know if Montek talked about it, but they have a biometric identification system. A lot of this is the work of Nanda Nilekani. And now they have a universal payments interface. They have a thriving digital thing. They had an explosion of mobile internet users thanks to the geo revolution. I mean, just a lot of pieces are coming together. The rural areas now have essentially mobile banking, even if they don't have a bank account, because of this is kind of infrastructure underneath. So anyway, I'm pretty enthusiastic about that. Would I say that's as powerful a growth engine as the earlier one? I'm not sure. No, I don't really know. But it certainly shouldn't be sneezed at. And it generates employment and generates inclusion, probably generates a fair amount of growth. And so it's different. They hasn't played out yet, so it's hard to be definitive about it, but it looks pretty optimistic and promising. And then on the academic side, I would say, my profession for a long time managed to ignore distributional issues with a variety of, circumlocutions, like if the aggregate benefits are big enough, we can compensate the losers, even if nobody could possibly think of a way of actually doing that. Now, we have just a massive amount of really good research, from Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and Raj Chetty and the recent John Bates Clark winner, Gabriel Zucman, and so on. So this is a different world. I mean, it's not hand waving anymore. And their work is not just in developed countries, but on a global basis. So I think that's helpful in bringing attention to the challenges. And I should say, also the work on poverty that Esther Duflo and Banerjee have done. Yeah. Maybe I can't remember their names, because I'm too old or because they're married or something. I don't know. Anyway, that I think is actually the underpinnings of some pretty helpful sort of stuff and guidance for policymakers.
Right. Great. let me turn to a different question. You've said that there's no chance of inclusive growth if sectors, I suppose it's the non-tradable sectors, if sectors like government, education, health, hospitality remain productivity backwaters. Take us
Right.
through your thinking. What do you mean and what's possible to do? What are you thinking here?
Well, so, 10 years ago, a South African by origin, Sandile Halachwayo, and I wrote a paper that tracked basically the structure of the American economy over 2 decades prior to that, 1990 to 2010. And this is kind of rocket science. It was, where do we generate employment? Where do we generate growth, meaning value added, when you do national income accounting properly at the sector level. Otherwise, you get double counting. I think most of your audience knows that. You can't add up the sales of every sector, because, or the output in dollars, because you're double counting the intermediate inputs. They sell stuff to each other. And then productivity in its simplest form, value added per person employed. And it was very striking. Anyway, so I won't try to summarize that, but we're doing the same thing again for the most recent 2 decades. And we divided the world into the tradable sector. That's basically goods and services that trade or can trade internationally. That doesn't mean you can't consume them at home. Okay, so it's not the same as trade. A big economy like the United States produces a lot of financial services that, some of which are delivered, offshore somewhere, and a lot of which are delivered in America. So, but it's tradable because you can. So basically tradable is manufacturing, all of manufacturing, and a bunch of tradable services. If you look at productivity performance in the tradable sector, it's just much higher than the non-tradable sector, right? Much higher. So in the most recent 2-decade period, it's like 3%. Most people would regard that as pretty good productivity growth. Whereas in the non-tradable sector, it's barely above 0.5%, as measured. Maybe we have measurement problems, but just forget that for a moment. Okay, so why is this interesting? It's interesting because almost 80% of employment in the United States economy is in the non-tradable sector, right? So if you don't get productivity growth there, you can't make up for it, with the other 20%, no matter how high it is, right? And so the point is, if we're really going to have a productivity surge, and I think, we'll get later on to a discussion about why that's probably possible with these powerful tools, especially the digital ones, it's just not going to happen, right? And if we stay on that trend that, the tradable sector, which tends to be higher incomes parts of the economy, because most of the stuff that is traded, if you go past manufacturing, is essentially services, right? It's part of the knowledge economy, broadly defined. If you look at the American economy, the big employment sectors are government, healthcare, hospitality, traditional retail, and construction, right? They have low productivity levels, low income levels on balance, and low productivity growth levels. They also all now have labor shortages because people don't want to work there, right? It's not flexible. Sometimes it's stressful. Sometimes it's dangerous. This is a legacy of the pandemic. And so 45% of the economy in terms of employment is in those 5 sectors. So, if nothing happens there on the productivity front, you're sort of dragging a 45% anchor around and trying to make up for it somewhere else. It just isn't going to happen. So we need a broad-based something that enables a broad-based technology surge, and especially in a supply-constrained world.
Let's come to talk to us about the digital revolution and then how that we could get more productive in those sectors of the economy, or how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, sort of is how I'm thinking about it, and how the people who are building the technologies are thinking about it, I guess. So there's several aspects of this. So we've already talked about a couple of them. We got a whole bunch of free services that Eric Brynjolfsson and his colleagues at Stanford, think people value fairly highly, even if they don't have to pay for them. Okay, so one dimension is maybe there's a whole bunch of stuff we already got that we don't have to pay for. And there's a real measurement problem, because if we don't pay for it, then basically it doesn't show up anywhere. It's a little bit like work, housework, especially for women, doesn't show up in GDP because there's no market transaction to go along with it. So that's one dimension. We've talked about the inclusive growth patterns. I think that's right. In the developed economies, in the let's call it the pre-AI world, it's lots of economic activity has the characteristic that people know how to do it, and this is crucial, and they know how to describe precisely how they do it. And if you can do those two things, especially the second, then you can ask a computer to do it because you can code it, right? And that had a big effect. I mean, David Autor and lots of other people have documented that this was an important source of job and income polarization. It knocked out middle income jobs in a lot of places. And so you've got, so with job and income, I mean, it knocked out middle income jobs. So if you look at the income distribution, the tails got fatter and the middle got suppressed. I don't think there's any example of a bimodal income distribution, at least that I've seen, meaning, this, like, right? So the tails dominate. So it didn't go that far, but it was a big effect. When you combine it with globalization, which basically took out in the American economy over 10 million manufacturing jobs, also, middle to high middle income jobs, you got a pretty big negative blow in terms of distributional things, at least from that sort of bit of history. Then came along this revolution. So artificial intelligence, which, for a long time had two parallel tracks. One track was, we'll figure out the logic of language and stuff like that. And then, we'll tell computer what the logic is, and the computer will be able to deal with language. That didn't work. I think the simplest way to see this, Anne, is in a much sort of what seems to human beings a much simpler domain. Let's just take recognizing objects, what they call in AI image recognition, right? So everybody on this call can recognize a chair when they see it. And they probably knew how to do that, sometime around age 5 onward. If I've sent students off and I say, take as many pages as you want and write the essential characteristics of a chair so that a computer will definitively be able to recognize a chair, just implementing your points. Well, it turns out there's millions and millions of different versions of a chair, and nobody's ever successfully done that. So that doesn't work, right? And it doesn't work for language, and it doesn't work for translation, and it just doesn't work for a lot of stuff. And so that track didn't work. And there was a thing called AI winter in the 1980s. This other track that started way back on the basis of neural networks, sort of by analogy with how humans process information and data, was sitting there in theory. Jeff Hinton and others, were kind of working on it. But to implement it, you need a massive amount of digital data, which we accumulated in the digital revolution over time. You need high-speed networks so you can get to it. But the real deal is you need very, very large amounts of computing power, what the tech people called compute for short. And so it was never really implemented, right? Or only at a small scale. And then as time went on, and the cloud computing services of the mega platforms got built, and there's massive computing power, and the chips got smaller, denser and faster, and all that. It's stuff everybody knows, but sometimes forgets it how revolutionary it is. You could implement this sort of neural network, deep learning, and it's a brute force method. So the way the AIs learn to recognize images is they go look at a lot of images and they have this kind of deep pattern recognition capability, right? And the output of AIs is predictions. They're not sure, but their best guess, 95%, this is a cat or a chair or whatever. And that just turned out to be a breakthrough. A revolution. And that all happened in the last decade. People were trying to do image recognition on the older kind of idea, and it didn't work very well. And somebody switched to this newer process. And, AI researcher at Google, then at Google, now at Stanford, Fei-Fei Li, organized essentially ImageNet, which was a competition on image recognition, and it just got better and better, and now it's better than humans on balance. And the same thing happened in you name it. So I think we're at the start of seeing what the kind of revolutionary characteristics that go along with that. But this is facial recognition, pluses and minuses. It's if you think of robots, right? If you can't, the robots have sensors, right? So they have some version of vision. If they have no idea what that thing is, it doesn't very helpful, right? If they're going to function in the physical world, which is what robots are supposed to do, whatever digital stuff's going on inside, they have to have these capabilities. Turns out they have to have something else, which is much harder to achieve. The latest round is these large language models, or generative AI. And I think that's gotten a lot of attention, partly because it was such a huge surprise. So the training data set was essentially the whole internet, as far as I could see. So that wasn't a constraint on anybody. You didn't have a whole lot of proprietary data. You needed very smart people to figure out how to do this. And then you needed a huge amount of computing power. But to me, the startling thing about the generative AI is that before it came along, most people that I talked to anyway would say these artificial intelligence units operate best in a well-defined and somewhat narrow domain. Okay, we're doing mathematics now, we're doing history, right? We're doing design images and whatnot. All right, and the idea was that they don't switch domains all that easily. This is something humans do relatively quickly. If I'm talking to you about the Renaissance and switch to math, it doesn't take you very long to figure out I changed the subject. But that's, however you and I and other humans do it, it's a pretty important characteristic. Generative AI doesn't have to be told in response to the prompts what you're doing. So it does one thing that's, look, you can get lost in the kind of hype about artificial general intelligence, which means essentially it's like a human being. But this is something that was thought to be something people did well, and AIs had a lot of trouble with, and so that barrier is partly broken down.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the economy, well, maybe I should say, but there's lots of applications of this in specific domains, right, where there is proprietary data. So a lot of the economic effects, the positive side, assuming we don't destroy political and social interaction with a mass of, these things generate unbelievable quantities of whatever you want, rubbish, fake news, etc. The other thing about it that's fascinating once you get into it is that there's this thing called hallucinations. Essentially, they make stuff up unless you introduce some way to stop them. And they're very funny stories. I mean, there's a New York Times story this last week, a lawyer used ChatGPT to file a suit on behalf of a client against an airline. And ChatGPT cited, I think it was 10 relevant legal cases, none of which existed. I mean, the guy's in real trouble. Google itself using Bard asked it to talk about inflation. They did a pretty good job, as is often true. Maybe not A+, but pretty good. And at the end, just copying what you often read in a serious article, it says, for further reading, you might want to look at the following 5 papers and books with very plausible titles. They didn't exist either. Just made it up.
Huh.
Yeah. In the world of creativity, you know, fake this and accuracy that don't matter. I mean, actually, you want it to make up stuff that you've never thought about before. So I don't think people, you know, my impression is this is sufficiently new that people haven't sort of figured out that, you know, sometimes, you know, making stuff up that's potentially pretty interesting, say to a designer or something like that, is actually interesting. And if it's not hallucinations, it's certainly, you know, going off on its own to create something with images or video or whatever. I mean, that's a short summary. You know, in the Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, was asked when they did a 60 Minutes thing on Bard and digital in general and Google, where is this version of artificial intelligence, the generative, going to have its biggest application? He said, well, the most direct impact is in the knowledge economy, right? Now, the knowledge economy is pretty broad, you know, so nurses have skills and, you know, interpret information in a fairly important way. And I can easily imagine they will have digital assistants, you know, and we're not just talking about scientists, although we are, or media people, or, you know, there's probably a few professions that are threatened. Like I would think copy editing, you know, for advertising would probably be not the optimal choice for the next generation in terms of career, but you know, there's going to be a lot of turbulence as this stuff gets implemented, and then you know, and then there's the downside risk. All big, really powerful, you know, scientific and technological things, once they arrive and can be used, have, you know, these risks that have to be managed, whether they're managed by the creators or the government or the people or whatever. You know, it's true of gene editing. We just got to be very careful. And the scientists know this, and these AI folks know it too. That's why they're talking about things like regulation and risk and so on.
So are you more optimistic or are you worried about this development?
No, I'm actually quite optimistic. So I think we'll find a way to prevent it from doing a huge amount of damage, I hope. And I think the potential, I mean, I was thinking that the digital technologies, well, it's not just digital. There's a revolution in biomedical science as well. It's going to help, maybe not with productivity, but with a lot of outcomes that matter to people in the broad area of health and well-being. But I thought, you know, there's a reasonable chance we'll get a productivity surge, you know, once the lagging sectors catch up and whatnot. I mean, with these tools, you know, I think the odds of getting that surge are, you know, just go way, way up, right? You can just see it coming. I mean, you know, you say, now we're doing computer code and ChatGPT starts writing code, right? You have to check it, right? But I mean, we just haven't had anything even remotely resembling this kind of power. I think the best guess is a lot of jobs will change, but the outcome will be digital assistants. Let me cite one thing. Eric Bernstein and his colleagues wrote a paper just published recently. I think it's still a working paper. Basically, what they did is they got, you know, in partnership with a consulting firm and a firm that has a big customer service operation in the tech area. So these are people that you have to talk to if you can't solve some tech thing, you know, in your computer or your network or something. So they got to know what they're talking about. And they started using audio recordings of all the customer service, customer interactions to see what worked, how fast they resolved the thing. Did they make somebody angry, by responding the wrong way? It wasn't just techie stuff. It was, how do you present yourself? Do you say, well, I'm happy to help you with that. I'm sure we can resolve it. There's big productivity surge. But the most interesting thing was if you array the customer service agents from the most experienced, most effective, down to the newcomers, who just haven't gone down the learning curve as fast, and ask where was the big impact? It was here, right? It's just, the thing it reminded me of, and I don't know if it's a good analogy, is the London taxi driver before and after Google Maps, right? So 5 years learning the streets of London, and now you've got Google Maps. And I don't mean they're as good as the experienced people, but they're a whole lot. The differential is significantly reduced. So that's a productivity surge, and actually a kind of, at a very micro level, a kind of inclusive pattern of change.
Very interesting. Mike, I'm going to take you back to something that we only discovered recently about the Growth Commission, because it's relevant to, leadership in this very complex world where you're head of a developing country or a middle-income country, and there are lots of unknowns, as you've been telling us. And you said some interesting things in your focus on leadership in the Growth Commission. So one of the questions I think we've got time for is, you mentioned that it's really important that leaders build consensus in favor of a viable growth model, and that any strategy needs sufficient time to develop, and you're going to amend as you go along, and you've got to take people with you. Can you talk a bit about that in a very complex world where developing countries have to accommodate a lot of new things happening before they're ready, almost? And tell us more about leadership and growth in this very challenging situation.
So this isn't meant to be comprehensive. So I think the first order of business is, leadership, by the way, is not necessarily a single person, right? It's usually, a group. And sometimes it's a single person who's very important, as Mandela was, for sure, in a kind of moral sense. The first order of business is, if that group is doing something other than pursuing the long run in public interest, meaning whatever it is, tribal loyalty, stealing stuff, etc. It just isn't going to happen because it's too hard. The second thing is, this is really demanding of leadership. You have to, if you don't live in a world where you're pretty sure you know how things are going and what causes what, you have to experiment, so you have a kind of, rational response to this, but you've got to also communicate that that's what you're doing, right? Just by analogy, right? Venture capital is by definition risky, right? They try stuff and, there's one or two home runs and, a bunch of failures and some other stuff in the middle, but everybody understands that, so, when you invest in a venture capital fund and there's two failures, and, one Google and, etc., people don't complain about the failures, right? But the world of public policy is different, right? You get penalized badly, if you fail. So the leadership has to say to people, both the bureaucrats and the people, who are kind of developing and trying out policies, it's okay. We don't expect all of these things to work. What we're doing is trying to find out what does work. And that's, so they have a role in, not just explaining to the general public that this is the vision we have, we think it's feasible, we're not going to bore you with a sort of 200-page strategy document. It's going to be, like a little lighter than that, but it's going to be plausible. And so that's partly communication and partly just vision. You have to overcome lots of kind of internal bickering and whatnot. That's not easy. And the other way I have come to think of it, this is an economist speaking, is if you're in a low or no growth equilibrium, normally you don't just slide out of it, right? It's a big jump. I mean, in economics, if we have two stable equilibria, they're far apart usually, and there's an unstable one in the middle. So if you slide toward the unstable one, you'll probably slide back. I mean, this is just an analogy, but I mean, economists will understand it. So what you need is you've got to hop over the unstable one and get to a very different place in terms of expectations and investment behavior and so on. And you got to convince people that that can be done. And so I think the hardest thing is at the start. I mean, I think the Growth Commission, had the view, I don't mean to say everybody, but I mean, my recollection is that once you start to succeed, it's kind of easier to convince people that it's going to work. But at the start, you don't have a track record, to sort of lean on, right? So you're just relying on your persuasive powers. All of these things are important. That doesn't mean that, a growth strategy that's fundamentally flawed is going to work. You can't overcome that. So you need something that is actually, has some of the characteristics that would give it a chance of working. But just the economics and the strategy are probably not enough.
You made this comment that I think follows from this, which will be familiar to South Africans, that if you want growth, you can't just have a simple list of policies and reforms, but you need a strategy and an agenda. We've kind of had a list of reforms the president's trying to implement, but we're going backwards rather than forwards in most respects. And you're saying it's something more.
Yeah, a strategy has components and you can list them, but the key to a strategy is they're coherent, right? I mean, in economics, we would say there's a model that says that these things, add up to something more than, the sum of the parts, because of the way they interact with each other. I mean, there's all kinds of versions of this. Economists are used to the idea of complements, right? So if this is a complement to that, then if you do this, you get more of that, whether it's investment. I mean, for example, I argued that public sector investment properly done, the reason it's so important is not just because it's standalone here, it's because it is a critical complement to private sector investment. It raises the return, or at least a fair amount of it raises the return to private investment, and that we know is crucial. So I mean, I think that's the essence of it. The problem with the list, and we have the same problem, right? Because all growth strategies are context specific when they're laid out in detail. South Africa is not going to do the same thing as Brazil. I mean, the initial conditions are different, the history is different, the value systems are different, and so on. So, once you get past the kind of very elementary, economics, there isn't anything general to say, except that elementary economics and something about sort of leadership. The problem the Washington Consensus had wasn't just that it was a list. It's a great list, actually. John Williamson, gets criticized for that. He always regretted the term Washington Consensus. But, when I compare it to, like the Growth Commission work, we were somewhere different, but not that different. The problem with a list is when it's treated as an a la carte menu. Right? Oh, I don't like that one. We won't do that. And then, well, I really like this one, right? That's a disaster, right? Because that list is meant to be a guide, to constructing a strategy, meaning a coherent set of policies that are designed specifically to get some outcomes, right? And usually when, you know, the a la carte menu problem arises, there's some ideological, you know, origin to it. You know, I really like markets, governments, you know, get too big, they get captured by special interests. I mean, these things are all partly true, right? But they're not the whole story. So that I think is kind of what we had in mind. No, you know, people came along after the Growth Commission and said, well, all these strategies are context specific. You didn't deal with them all. You just produced a list of things you ought to think about. Fair enough. Maybe the list helped people because it wasn't just a list. I mean, it kind of hung together a little bit. At least I thought it did.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of what's been a fascinating conversation. We've ranged far and wide, and I've certainly learned a great deal more about your thinking, the Growth Commission, and also the sort of digital world or artificial intelligence that we're moving towards. Thank you very much, Michael. This has been fascinating, and we really appreciate you spending time with us. Hopefully a bit more on South Africa if this new project emerges.
I hope so too. Yeah, thank you, Anne. It was a pleasure being with you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to close our session tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Good night.